The glass shattered against the floorboards, a sound as sharp and final as a bone breaking. It was the third one that week. Grace flinched, her body already coiling in anticipation of the blow that would surely follow. The air in Blackwood Saloon was always thick with the smell of stale whiskey, wet wool, and the particular sourness of men who had given up on washing. But tonight a bitter cold seeped through the walls, making the stench even fouler, making every breath feel like swallowing razors. Her cough had been getting worse, a dry, rattling thing that shook her thin frame and made her vision swim with black spots at the edges. Sickness was a liability, and Harold Blackwood did not tolerate liabilities. He was a man built of hard angles and harder resentments, his face set in a permanent scowl that seemed carved from the same weathered wood as the bar he stood behind. The lines around his mouth told stories of cruelty perfected over decades, first as a prison guard down in Wyoming territory, then as the proprietor of this godforsaken hole in the frozen heart of Montana. He moved from behind the bar, now his heavy boots making the floorboards groan under his weight. Each step was deliberate, measured the walk of a man who knew his power and enjoyed wielding it. The patrons, a grim collection of trappers and failed prospectors whose dreams had frozen solid somewhere between here and the played-out gold claims to the west, fell silent. Their eyes gleamed with the cruel curiosity of men watching a dog get kicked. Not because they enjoyed it exactly, but because it was something to look at, something to break the monotony of another Montana winter that seemed like it would never end. Grace kept her gaze fixed on the glittering shards of glass swimming in a puddle of spilled beer. The lamplight caught the edges, making them sparkle like fool's gold. To look up was to invite a worse punishment. She had learned that in her first week here 4 months ago, when the world she thought she understood had revealed itself to be built on lies. Her father had been a tailor in San Francisco's Chinatown, a quiet man with gentle hands who could make a silk dress sing under his needle. He had taught her to read both English and Cantonese, sitting up late by candlelight in their tiny room above the shop, his finger tracing the characters, while her young voice stumbled over the sounds. Words are bridges between people, he used to say. Words can take you anywhere. He had saved for 8 years. Every penny that did not go to rent or rice went into a tin box hidden beneath the floorboards. $400. A fortune. Enough to send his daughter to Denver, where his brother had a merchant business and could give her opportunities that San Francisco's cramped, prejudiced streets never would. The letter had been so promising. Come to Denver. I will find you good work. You will have a better life. But when Grace had stepped off the stagecoach in Denver that cool October morning, her uncle was 6 months dead. Pneumonia, the man who met her said. Terrible shame. He had kind eyes and a practiced smile, and he said he was her uncle's business partner, here to help. He took her papers. He took the $30 she had sewn into the hem of her dress. He took her to a back room and sold her to a labor contractor for $200. The debt they told her was $350. Passage from Denver to Montana. Room and board. The clothes on her back, which were not even hers but borrowed from a trunk of garments Blackwood kept for exactly this purpose. Every day she worked, 50 cents came off the debt. But every mistake, every broken glass or spilled drink or moment of weakness when her cough made her double over added $2 or $3 back on. The mathematics of it were designed to be inescapable. Pick it up! Blackwood's voice was a low growl, a rusty nail scraping across stone. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of absolute authority. Her hands trembled as she knelt the rough wood, digging into her knees through the thin gray fabric of her dress. Each shard she gathered was a tiny cold star of pain, promising a larger, hotter one to come. Her fingertips were already crisscrossed with small cuts from previous cleanings. The scars would never fully heal. You cost me money, girl. Every time you breathe, you cost me money. His shadow fell over her, a suffocating blanket. She could feel the heat of his rage, smell the sourness on his breath, the scent of rot in whiskey and something darker, something that spoke of a man who had long ago made peace with his own cruelty. He believed he owned her labor, her pain, her very breath. He had paid for her passage, paid off the contractor, and he reminded her of this debt with his fists and his belt and the casual violence of a man who knew the law would never touch him for what he did to Chinese contract labor. Every time she faltered, every time she dropped a piece of glass, his patience always a sliver. Thin thing held together by self-interest alone snapped entirely. His hand shot out, grabbing a fistful of her dark hair and yanked her head back. A cry tore from her throat, raw and involuntary, the sound of an animal caught in a trap it cannot escape. Too sick to work. I'll give you something to be sick about, you yellow. The word that followed was one she had heard before many times in many voices. It no longer had the power to wound in the way it once had. The greater wound was being here at all. The greater wound was surviving. His other hand rose and she closed her eyes, a familiar litany of terror and resignation washing over her like cold water. Her body tensed for impact. This was the moment when time always seemed to stretch and slow, when every detail became painfully sharp. The smell of wood smoke and unwashed men, the crackle of the fire in the iron stove, the creaking of the building as wind threw fresh snow against the walls. 23 men in this room and not one would lift a finger to help her. Why would they? This was not their business. This was just how things were. But the blow never landed. A different sound cut through the charged silence of the saloon. The deliberate scrape of a chair leg against the floor, loud and purposeful in that frozen moment. A statement made without words. That's enough. The voice was quiet, yet it commanded the entire room. It was flat, devoid of emotion, but it carried a weight that made the air feel suddenly heavy, as if a storm front had just moved through the door. Grace dared to open her eyes, her vision still blurred from unshed tears and the pain of having her hair yanked back. A man stood by a table in the corner. A man she had noticed before in the vague way one notices furniture or shadows, but never truly seen. He was tall and broad-dressed in worn buckskin that had been patched and repatched over years of hard use. His face was shadowed by the brim of a hat that had seen better decades. He was not a brawler or a drunk. He was not like the other men in this place with their loud voices and their need to fill every silence with crude jokes or cruder stories. He was just there. Still, like a mountain is still. Blackwood, still holding Grace's hair, turned his scowl on the stranger. The violence in his eyes shifted targets, seeking a new outlet. This ain't your business, rancher. Move on. The man, this stranger whose name Grace did not know, did not move. He just looked at Blackwood. His eyes were dark and unreadable in the dim light, but there was something in them that made Blackwood's grip on Grace's hair loosen slightly. Not fear exactly, but recognition. The recognition of a man who had seen violence and knew its true cost. I said that's enough. The words were delivered in the same flat tone. No anger, no righteousness. Just a simple statement of fact, like noting that the sky was gray or the temperature was dropping. The stranger reached into his coat and produced a small leather pouch. He placed it on the table with a soft thunk that seemed to echo in the silence. Blackwood's eyes narrowed, flicking from the pouch to Grace to the stranger and back again. He released Grace's hair with a shove that sent her sprawling forward. She caught herself on the edge of a table, her hands screaming with pain where the glass cuts opened fresh. For the girl's debt, the stranger said, and the broken glass. Blackwood moved to the table, his boots heavy and deliberate. He picked up the pouch and opened it. Inside, gold coins caught the lamplight. 18 of them, $20 each, $360 total. More than Grace's debt, more than she was worth to Blackwood, especially now that her cough was getting worse and her productivity was dropping day by day. The calculation happened behind Blackwood's eyes. Grace could see it playing out. The money in hand versus the diminishing returns of keeping her. The pleasure of cruelty versus the practicality of profit. In the end, as it always did with men like Blackwood, profit won. Take the broken thing then. She's no good to me anyway. He shoved the pouch into his vest pocket and turned away, already dismissing her from his thoughts. Grace was no longer his property. She was no longer anything to him at all. Just another transaction closed, another ledger balanced. The stranger did not look at her. His focus remained entirely on Blackwood, a silent warning passing between them. An understanding that if Blackwood sent men after them, those men would not return. Then he walked toward the door, his movements economical and sure, like a man who had learned long ago not to waste energy on unnecessary motion. He paused at the threshold, his back to the room. The wind howled outside, throwing ice crystals against the walls in a sound like thrown sand. Come on. It was not a question or a plea. It was a simple statement of fact like saying the sun would rise or winter would end eventually. An observation about what would happen next. For a moment, Grace was frozen, caught between the familiar monster and the terrifying unknown. But then she saw the open door beyond the stranger's silhouette, saw the swirl of snow in the darkness beyond, saw a choice maybe the only one she had ever truly had. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the searing pain in her knee where it had hit the floor, ignoring the mocking laughter that erupted from some of the patrons as she ran. Her feet slipped on the floor, still wet from spilled beer, but she caught herself and kept moving. Through the door, into the storm. The blizzard hit her like a solid wall. The wind screamed, stealing the air from her lungs before she could draw a full breath. Snow came at her horizontally, billions of tiny ice needles that found every gap in her thin dress and drove through to the skin beneath. The cold was instant and absolute, a physical force that seemed determined to stop her heart in her chest. But it was clean, cold and clean. Not the oily, suffocating atmosphere of the saloon, not the smell of Blackwood's breath, or the weight of his hands. This was honest cruelty, the cruelty of nature that had no malice, only indifference. The stranger was already at his horse, a big, steady Tennessee walker that stood unbothered by the storm, its winter coat thick and its eyes calm. The man pulled a heavy oilskin coat from his saddle roll and threw it over Grace's shoulders without a word. It was massive on her, the hem dragging in the snow, but it was warm. It smelled of pine and leather and wood smoke. It smelled like safety, though she did not yet have words for that feeling. He mounted the horse in one smooth motion and reached a hand down to her. His grip was strong and sure, pulling her up behind him without apparent effort. She wrapped her arms around his waist, her hands barely meeting on the other side, and buried her face in the rough fabric of his coat. The world dissolved into a blinding chaos of white. The journey was a blur of biting wind and suffocating snow. Grace clung to the solid warmth of the man in front of her, the only anchor in a world that had dissolved into a howling frozen void. The cold was a physical entity, a predator with teeth of ice that gnawed at her through the layers of wool and oilskin. Her cough returned deep and ragged, tearing at her chest and leaving her dizzy and weak. She did not know how long they rode. Hours, certainly. It felt like an eternity. The rhythmic sway of the horse beneath her, the steady presence of the stranger, and the roar of the storm were all that existed. There was no past, no future. Only this endless present of cold and motion, and the desperate need to simply hold on. Just when she thought the cold would finally consume her, would freeze the very blood in her veins and stop her heart in her chest, the horse slowed. Through the swirling snow, a faint golden light appeared. A single window, a beacon of impossible warmth in an impossible world. They had arrived at a small, isolated cabin tucked into a stand of old-growth pines. The trees themselves hunched against the wind like weary giants, their branches heavy with snow, creating a slight windbreak that made the air around the cabin marginally less violent. The stranger slid off the horse and lifted her down, his hands gentle but firm. Her legs buckled numb and useless, and he caught her without comment, half carrying her to the heavy wooden door. The moment he pushed it open, warmth washed over her like a blessing. It was a staggering physical relief that made her gasp. The cabin was small, single room, but it was clean and orderly. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a healthy fire crackling within, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn log walls. A simple cot lay in one corner. A sturdy table and two chairs occupied the center. Shelves lined one wall, holding books and supplies in neat rows. It was a place of quiet solitude, a world away from the noise and filth and casual violence of the saloon. He led her to a chair near the fire, and she sank into it, her body trembling uncontrollably, now that the immediate danger had passed. The stranger moved with quiet efficiency, first banking the fire to increase its heat, then ladling steaming broth from a pot that hung over the flames. He placed the warm bowl in her hands. Her fingers were so numb she could barely feel the heat, but she clutched it anyway, drawing it close to her chest. He said nothing, simply moved back to tend to his horse, giving her space and privacy. The silence in the cabin was as profound as the storm's roar had been. It was a living thing, a silence that felt safe, a silence without threat. Grace sipped the broth, the hot liquid a balm to her raw throat, and watched him through the open door as he worked. He moved with a kind of contained stillness, a man who had pared his life down to the essentials. Every motion had purpose. Nothing was wasted. He was careful with the horse, removing the saddle, rubbing down the animal's coat where snow had melted, and frozen again, checking each hoof with the attention of a man who understood that out here a lame horse was a death sentence. When he came back inside, he brought a thick wool blanket and draped it over her shoulders without meeting her eyes. "You're safe here," he said, his voice that same low rumble as before. "No one will bother you," he gestured to the cot in the corner. "Get some rest." Then he took a second blanket and settled into the chair on the other side of the hearth, turning his gaze to the fire as if to stand watch over her sleep. The Winchester rifle leaned against the wall within easy reach of his hand. For the first time in years, Grace lay down without fear. The fire crackled, the wind howled outside the sturdy walls, and she drifted into an exhausted, dreamless sleep wrapped in the warmth of a stranger's kindness. When she woke, she did not know how much time had passed. The cabin was still warm. The fire still burned. Through the single window, she could see that the storm continued, the world beyond reduced to a shifting wall of white. The stranger sat exactly where he had been when she fell asleep, though his posture suggested he had not slept at all. The rifle still rested against his chair. On the table beside her cot, a bowl of oatmeal waited, still warm, sweetened with honey. He must have prepared it and placed it there while she slept, moving silently to avoid waking her. He did not speak as she sat up, did not ask how she felt or offer false comfort. He simply stood, put on his heavy coat, and went outside to check his traps and gather more firewood. The message was clear, without words. This was his routine. She was welcome to be part of it, but he would not change his ways or make a performance of caring. It was, Grace realized, the most respectful thing anyone had done for her in months. He was treating her not as a rescued victim who needed constant reassurance, but as a person capable of understanding the situation without elaborate explanation. She ate the oatmeal slowly, her stomach unused to rich food after months of thin soup and stale bread. Then she stood on unsteady legs and looked around the cabin with clearer eyes. Everything spoke of a man living alone, but living with intention. The books on the shelf were worn from reading. Philosophy mostly, Thoreau's Walden, Whitman's Leaves of Grass, Marcus Aurelius in translation. Not the reading material she would have expected from a mountain hermit. The few dishes were clean, the floor was swept, the firewood was stacked with the precision of a man who understood that disorder led to inefficiency, and inefficiency led to death. In the corner near the cot, she found a wooden chest. She did not open it, not yet, but simply noting its presence. Personal belongings, perhaps. Memories from whatever life he had lived before becoming the silent guardian of an empty mountain. The storm continued for 3 more days. Grace slept more in that time than she had in years. Deep, restorative sleep punctuated by fits of coughing that slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to ease. The stranger was a constant, unobtrusive presence. He would leave bowls of soup or plates of stewed rabbit on the table when she woke. The fire was always banked and warm. He moved about the cabin with practiced economy, his footsteps soft on the wooden floor. He never pressed her for conversation. Never asked what had happened to her, though the fading bruises on her face and the scars on her arms told their own story. He treated her not as a burden or a curiosity, but as a person deserving of quiet dignity. This gentle respect was more healing than any medicine. Slowly, she began to move around the small space. Her body ached, protesting every movement, but she was growing stronger. She would fold the blankets on her cot in the morning, her movements stiff and careful. She washed the bowls in a basin of heated water, the simple domestic act feeling foreign and profound after months of forced labor under Blackwood's fists. He would watch her sometimes, his expression unreadable, before turning back to mending a piece of tack or sharpening a knife. The silence between them was no longer the empty, watchful silence of that first night. It had softened, becoming a comfortable space filled with unspoken understanding. On the 4th day, when the storm finally showed signs of breaking, he spoke to her directly for the first time since telling her she was safe. "There's more fabric in that chest, and warmer clothes if you want them." He nodded toward the wooden chest at the foot of his own sleeping area, then returned his attention to the piece of leather he was working, oiling it to keep it supple in the cold. Grace looked at the chest, then at him. The offer was simple, practical, yet it felt like a monumental gift. It was an acknowledgement of her presence, of her future, beyond this immediate moment of recovery. The next morning, after he had gone out to check his trap lines, she opened the chest. Inside, folded neatly, were flannel shirts and sturdy wool trousers. They were men's clothes, his clothes, but they were clean and warm. She chose a dark blue flannel shirt, the fabric soft against her skin despite the roughness of its weave. The sleeves were too long, hanging past her fingertips. She rolled them up carefully, methodically, each fold precise. She found the trousers and put them on as well, cinching them tight with a length of rope. Looking down at herself, she felt a strange sense of being both protected and anonymous. She was shedding the gray, tattered skin of her old life, becoming something else, someone else. When he came back inside from checking his traps, his arms full of firewood, he stopped for a moment. His eyes took in the sight of her in his shirt and trousers. For just a second, something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening. Then he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod and continued on with his task. A silent approval, a silent acceptance. That afternoon, he did something unexpected. He took down the rifle from its pegs on the wall and held it out to her. "You need to know how to use this." His voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were teaching her how to bank a fire or how to tell north from the moss on the trees. Grace stared at the weapon. She had never held a gun before. In her father's house, there had been no need. In Blackwood's saloon, she had not been permitted. The stranger, seeing her hesitation, did not push. He simply stood there, patient as stone, holding the rifle steady. Finally, she reached out and took it. It was heavier than she expected, the wood warm from its place near the fire, the metal cold and unforgiving. Over the next hour, he taught her, not with many words, but with demonstration and gentle correction. How to hold it so the recoil would not injure her. How to sight along the barrel. How to breathe and squeeze, not pull the trigger. They went outside into the snow that was finally beginning to ease, and he set up targets. Tin cans on a fallen log 30 yards away. Her first shot went wide, the crack of the rifle startling her despite his warning. Her shoulder ached from the recoil. But he simply nodded, told her to try again, and she did, over and over. By the time they went back inside, she had hit the tin can 3 times out of 10 attempts. "Good enough," he said. "You'll practice more." It was not praise exactly, but it was acknowledgement that she was capable of learning, capable of protecting herself. And that acknowledgement meant more than any flowery compliment ever could. That evening, they sat on opposite sides of the hearth, as had become their custom. The fire crackled between them. He was reading from a small, well-worn book, his lips moving slightly as he followed the words. She was mending the tear in her old gray dress, even though she no longer wore it. The act of repair felt important somehow, a way of honoring what she had survived. The silence was comfortable now, familiar, but there was a question that had been sitting on her tongue for days, growing heavier with each passing hour. Tonight, with the wind quiet outside and the fire warm, and the world reduced to just this small cabin, and the two of them within it, the question felt light enough to speak. Why, her voice was barely a whisper, rough from disuse and the lingering effects of her cough. He did not look up from his book immediately. For a long moment, she thought he would not answer, that she had broken some unspoken rule of their careful peace. But then he closed the book slowly, his thumb marking his place, and raised his eye to meet hers. "Why did you help me?" she clarified, though she suspected he had understood the question the first time. He looked at her for a long moment. In the firelight, she could see details of his face that the shadows had hidden before. He was older than she had first thought. Not old, but weathered. Lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind. A small scar along his jawline. And in his eyes, a bleakness that made her breath catch. "Because I didn't help someone else once." The words were simple, but they fell between them like stones dropped into still water. He turned his head, and his eyes met hers fully in the flickering light. They were filled with a darkness that stole her breath. Not the darkness of cruelty, but of profound regret. "A long time ago, I was younger, prouder. I was a sergeant in the Army, 3rd Infantry Regiment. We fought in Mexico back in 46 through 48. He paused, his gaze dropping to the fire, as if the memory were playing out in the flames. "There was a boy, a Mexican kid, maybe 12 years old. My captain used him, beat him. I saw it happening. I knew it was wrong. I reported it to the colonel." Another pause. His hands resting on the arms of his chair tightened until his knuckles went white. They gave me 50 lashes for disrespecting an officer, tied me to a wagon wheel in front of the whole company, and flogged me until I passed out from the pain. When I woke up in the medical tent 3 days later, they told me the boy had hanged himself. Found him in the stables with a rope around his neck. Grace felt tears prick at her eyes. Not for herself, but for him. For the boy. For the terrible weight he had been carrying alone. I saw my captain a week later. The stranger continued, his voice flat and empty, laughing in the officer's mess like nothing had happened. I deserted that night. Been 12 years now. Came out here. Built this cabin. Stayed away from people. He finally looked up at her again. I didn't help that boy in time. I tried, but I didn't try hard enough. I won't make that mistake again. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and unvarnished. He had not intervened for her because he was a hero. He had done it because he was a man living with the ghost of a boy he had failed to save. The weight of his guilt was a tangible thing in the small room. Grace felt her own story rising in her throat. Not the story of Blackwood and the beatings, though that was part of it. The story before that. The longer, more complicated story of how she had come to be in that saloon in the first place. My father was a scholar, she said, softly, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. He had a tailor shop in San Francisco in Chinatown. But before that, back in China, he had been a teacher. He taught me to read, both English and Cantonese. He said words were bridges between people. She traced a pattern on the fabric in her lap, not looking at the stranger, focusing on the motion of her fingers. He saved every penny from his shop. For 8 years. He wanted to send me to Denver, where my uncle had a merchant business. He thought it would be a better life, away from the prejudice and the cramped streets and the hard stairs. Her voice caught slightly, but she pushed on. His bridge led me to a dead end. When I got to Denver, my uncle had been dead for 6 months. Pneumonia. The man who met me at the station said he was my uncle's business partner. He seemed kind. He took my papers. He took the money I had sewn into my dress. And then he sold me to a labor contractor who sold me to Blackwood. She finally looked up, meeting the stranger's eyes. The debt was $350 for passage and room and clothes I never asked for. Every day I worked, they took off 50 cents, but every mistake added $2 or $3 back. The numbers were designed so I could never pay it off. Never be free. The stranger's jaw tightened, but he did not speak, simply listened, giving her the space to tell her story in her own way. My father thought he was building a bridge to a better life, Grace finished quietly, but it just led me to a cage. They sat in silence after that. The fire crackled. The wind had finally died outside, leaving a profound quiet in its wake. But the silence between them was different now. It was deeper, richer. A space no longer defined by what was unsaid, but by what was finally understood. He was not just her rescuer. She was not just his ward. They were two people haunted by the cruelty of the world who had found a momentary fragile sanctuary in each other's presence. That night, when Grace lay down to sleep, she felt something she had not felt in years. Not happiness exactly, not even hope, which seemed too bright and fragile a thing for the world she knew, but something quieter, something that felt like the possibility of healing. In his chair by the fire, the stranger sat watch as he had every night since bringing her here, the rifle across his lap, his eyes on the darkness beyond the window, standing guard against whatever might come. But for the first time in 12 years, Ethan Cole did not feel entirely alone with his ghosts. The days that followed took on a gentle rhythm. The storm had finally broken, leaving the world outside buried under 4 feet of fresh snow that gleamed blindingly white in the weak winter sun. The cabin, snug in its stand of pines, remained a world apart. A place where time moved differently, measured not in hours or days, but in the small rituals of survival and recovery. Grace grew stronger. Her cough, while not gone entirely, became less frequent and less violent. The color returned to her cheeks. She moved with more confidence, no longer the hunted, cowering thing that had stumbled through Blackwood's door, but something harder. Something that had been tested and not broken. She took on tasks without being asked. Keeping the fire fed, sweeping the floor, preparing meals from the supplies Ethan brought in from his small cache buried outside. She discovered that she remembered more than she thought from the years before the saloon. Her father had taught her to cook back when they had more than rice and vegetables. The skills came back to her hands like old friends. One morning, Ethan brought in a rabbit from his trap line. He laid it on the table with a knife beside it, then looked at her, a silent question in his eyes. She hesitated for only a moment before nodding. She knew how to do this. It was a skill from a life she rarely allowed herself to remember. Her hands, though still marked by scars from broken glass and hard labor, moved with remembered efficiency. Ethan watched her clean and prepare the rabbit, his expression thoughtful. He had seen the fragility, the fear. Now he was seeing the resilience that had been there all along, buried under months of brutality. It was a subtle shift in their dynamic. She was no longer just a victim he had rescued. She was becoming a partner in this small, isolated world they shared. The long evenings were the quietest time. They would sit on opposite sides of the hearth, the fire crackling between them. Sometimes he would read from his small collection of books, his voice a low murmur that was more a comforting sound than a story she followed closely. Other times they would simply sit in silence, watching the flames dance and cast shadows on the walls. It was in these moments that she would catch glimpses of the man behind the stoic facade, a flicker of pain in his eyes when he thought she was not looking. The way his hand would sometimes clench into a fist for no apparent reason, as if gripping something invisible. He was a man at war with his own ghosts, and his self-imposed exile in this remote cabin was his battleground. One evening she nearly dropped a hot pan, and he moved with startling speed to catch it. His hand brushed hers in the process. The contact was brief, a fleeting warmth, but it sent a jolt through her. It was the first time they had touched since he had pulled her onto his horse in the storm. He pulled his hand back quickly, his face settling back into its usual mask of control. But she had seen it, a flicker of longing, of a loneliness as profound as her own. Neither of them spoke of it, but something had changed. The air between them felt charged with possibilities neither was ready to name. The days took on a rhythm as steady as the beating of a heart. Grace woke each morning to find a bowl of oatmeal waiting on the table, still warm, sweetened with honey from a clay jar Ethan kept on the shelf. He would already be outside by then, checking his trap lines or splitting wood, his breath misting in the cold air. She would eat slowly, savoring each bite, her body still adjusting to regular meals after months of near starvation. By the time he returned, she would have washed the dishes and swept the floor. Not because he asked, but because the simple domestic acts gave her a sense of purpose, a sense of reclaiming small pieces of normalcy from the wreckage of her life. On the 25th day since the blizzard, the weather began to shift. The brutal deep freeze eased slightly, and the snow, while still thick on the ground, developed a crust hard enough to walk on without sinking to the knees. Spring was still months away, but winter was beginning to loosen its grip just enough to make travel possible again. Ethan came in from checking his traps and stood for a long moment by the door, brushing snow from his coat. Grace could tell something was weighing on him. His movements, usually so economical and certain, carried a hesitation she had not seen before. "I need supplies," he said finally, not meeting her eyes. "Trip takes 2 days, maybe 3 if the weather turns again. I need to go to Coldwater." The name of the town hit Grace like a physical blow. Coldwater, where Blackwood's saloons squatted like a cancer in the center of the settlement, where men like Fletcher drank and made their deals and sold human beings like livestock. Her first instinct was to ask to beg to go with him, but she swallowed the words. She understood the mathematics of survival. 2 people traveling meant slower progress, meant using more supplies, meant complications if they encountered trouble. And she would be a liability, still recovering, still learning the skills needed to survive in this unforgiving landscape. "You can come," Ethan continued, finally looking at her, "or stay here with the rifle." There was no judgment in his voice, no expectation either way, simply a statement of the available choices. "I'll stay," Grace said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I won't slow you down." Something shifted in Ethan's expression, not quite approval, but a recognition of pragmatism, of understanding the harsh realities without flinching from them. "All right, then I need to teach you a few more things." Over the next 3 days, Ethan transformed from silent companion to exacting instructor. He taught her to read the forest, how to distinguish the tracks of deer from elk, of wolf from coyote, how to tell how long ago the tracks had been made by the sharpness of their edges and the amount of snow that had drifted into them. How to recognize the signs of human passage, the broken branches and disturbed snow that spoke of someone moving with intent rather than the random wanderings of wildlife. He taught her how to set the simple snare traps he used for rabbits, how to place them along game trails where the animals would not see them until too late, how to kill quickly and cleanly, minimizing suffering, how to skin and butcher skills her father had taught her years ago, but which came back to her hands with surprising ease. He taught her how to shoot from inside the cabin, how to rest the rifle barrel on the windowsill for stability, how to aim at center mass because a wounded man was more dangerous than a dead one or a missed shot, how to reload quickly in the dark by feel alone because if she needed to reload, it meant the first shot had not been enough. Most importantly, he taught her how to barricade the door, how to wedge the heavy table against it and brace it with chairs, how to have water and food within reach so she would not need to leave her defensive position, how to wait, how to be patient, how to not open the door for anyone no matter what they said or promised. On the morning of the 29th day, Ethan prepared to leave. He saddled Jasper with the same methodical care he brought to every task, checked the horse's hooves, adjusted the straps, loaded saddlebags with furs to trade for supplies. Grace stood in the doorway, wrapped in one of his spare coats, watching. The Winchester leaned against the wall beside him. On the table inside a small leather pouch sat waiting. Ethan had placed it there the night before without ceremony. If I don't come back in 4 days, he had said, his voice flat and matter-of-fact, take Jasper and ride east to Fort Ellis. Show them this. He had handed her a tarnished military badge. Sergeant Ethan Cole, 3rd Infantry Regiment. The metal was cold in her palm. They'll help you get to California. There's $200 in that pouch. Enough to start over. Grace had looked at the badge, then at him. You'll come back. It had not been a question, not a plea, simply a statement of faith that surprised them both. Now as he swung up into the saddle, he looked down at her. 4 days, he repeated. You'll wait. I'll wait. He nodded once, turned Jasper's head toward the trail, and rode away without looking back. Grace stood in the doorway until he disappeared into the trees, then went inside and barred the door. The first day alone passed slowly. Grace kept herself busy with small tasks. She fed the fire. She prepared food. She cleaned the cabin until every surface gleamed. She practiced loading and unloading the rifle until her fingers could do it by muscle memory alone. But as evening approached, the silence grew oppressive. She had grown accustomed to Ethan's presence, to the quiet sounds of him moving through the space, the scrape of his knife against wood as he carved, the soft rustle of pages turning as he read, the steady rhythm of his breathing across the room. Now there was only the wind and the settling of the wolves and the beating of her own anxious heart. Night fell. She sat in Ethan's chair with the rifle across her lap, staring at the door. Every sound made her jump. The crack of a branch under the weight of snow, the scrabble of some small animal across the roof, the distant howl of wolves, their voices rising and falling in eerie harmony. She did not sleep that first night, could not sleep. When dawn finally came gray and cold, she felt hollowed out by exhaustion and fear. The second day was easier. She forced herself to go outside to check the 2 nearest traps as Ethan had shown her, found a rabbit in one, killed it cleanly with a quick twist that broke its neck, brought it back and skinned it, her hands remembering the motions. The practical work steadied her nerves. That night, she allowed herself to sleep for a few hours, waking at every small sound, but managing to rest between the jolts of adrenaline. On the afternoon of the second day while cleaning, Grace accidentally knocked against the bed frame. One of the floorboards beneath it shifted slightly. She froze, looking down. The board was looser than the others, deliberately so. Her hand moved almost of its own accord. She pried up the board with her fingernails. Beneath it, nestled in the gap between joists, sat a small metal box. Grace knew she should not open it. This was Ethan's private space, his secrets. But her hands were already moving, lifting the box, feeling its weight. Light. Whatever was inside was not heavy. She opened it. Inside lay 3 items. A military badge twin to the one he had given her. A letter written in a child's careful hand on paper that had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases were nearly torn through. And a small piece of red fabric, faded and worn. Grace unfolded the letter with trembling fingers. Ethan, if you're reading this, I'm gone. Don't blame yourself. You tried to help me. You got hurt trying. I know what the captain did to you. I know it was because you told about what he was doing to me. I can't live with what he did, but I want you to know it's not your fault. You were the only one who tried. Thank you for trying. Your friend Daniel. Grace read the letter 3 times. Each word was a window into Ethan's soul. The boy had not blamed him, had thanked him, but Ethan had spent 12 years carrying the weight of that death anyway, convinced that he had failed, convinced that trying had not been enough. She carefully refolded the letter and placed everything back in the box exactly as she had found it. Replaced the board, smoothed the rug over it. She did not tell Ethan when he returned. Some wounds were too private to expose without permission. But she understood him now in a way she had not before. Understood why he had saved her. Why he lived alone. Why he moved through the world like a man doing penance for sins that were not truly his. But that night, as she lay in the darkness, listening to the wind, she made a silent vow. If Fletcher came, if they had to fight, she would not let Ethan carry the burden of another death alone. She had already decided something in the deepest part of herself, something she would not speak aloud until the moment demanded it. If it came to killing, if there was a choice to be made, she would be the one to bear that weight. She would not let him break his vow again. While Grace waited alone in the cabin, Ethan rode through the frozen landscape toward Coldwater. The trip took longer than usual. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, covering the trail and making Jasper work harder with each step. By the time the rough buildings of the settlement came into view, the sun was already past its zenith, hanging low and pale in the western sky. Coldwater was exactly as he remembered. A muddy main street lined with a general store, a blacksmith, a livery stable, and Blackwood's saloon, its false front painted garish red that had faded to the color of old blood. A handful of other structures huddled nearby, as if for warmth. Perhaps 50 people lived here year-round, more in summer when the trappers and prospectors came through. Ethan tied Jasper to the hitching post outside Samuel's general store and went inside. The warmth hit him immediately, along with the smell of coffee and cured meat and lamp oil. Samuel stood behind the counter, an old man with white whiskers and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Cole," Samuel said by way of greeting. "Didn't expect to see you until spring." "Needed supplies sooner than planned," Ethan replied, pulling out his list. 20 pounds of flour, 10 of salt, sugar, coffee, seeds for planting, 2 boxes of 44-40 ammunition. Samuel nodded and began gathering items. "Heard you bought that Chinese girl from Blackwood." Ethan's hand stilled for a fraction of a second. "I paid her debt." Samuel glanced up. "Sure you did. Just saying, Blackwood's been asking around. Says she stole from him." "She didn't. I believe you." Samuel's voice was carefully neutral. "But Blackwood don't, and he's hired Fletcher to find her." The name hit Ethan like a fist to the gut. Thomas Fletcher, the man who had reported him for insubordination 12 years ago. The man who had stood and watched while they tied Ethan to the wagon wheel and flogged him until he passed out from the pain. The man who had smiled while doing it. Fletcher's here in Coldwater was, left 2 days ago, heading into the backcountry from what I hear. Ethan paid for his supplies in silence, his mind racing. 2 days. Fletcher could be anywhere in a 2-day radius. Could be 50 miles away, could be 5 miles away, could be watching the trail to Ethan's cabin right now waiting. He loaded the supplies onto Jasper with mechanical efficiency, then walked down the street toward the saloon. Not to go inside, but to confirm what he already suspected. The poster was nailed to a post outside, rough paper already curling from moisture. The drawing was crude but recognizable. A young Chinese woman. Reward $100 for her return to Harold Blackwood. Contact Thomas Fletcher, bounty agent. Ethan stood looking at it for a long moment. $100 was 3 months' wages for a working man. Enough to make most people willing to overlook questions of right and wrong. Enough to ensure that anyone who saw Grace would turn her in without hesitation. "Looking for work, friend," the voice came from behind him. Ethan turned slowly. Thomas Fletcher stood there, leaner than Ethan remembered, but with the same cold eyes, the same thin smile. He wore a long coat that did not quite hide the pistol at his hip or the knife strapped to his thigh. Tools of his trade. The two men looked at each other across 6 feet of frozen mud. 12 years collapsed into nothing. They were back in Mexico, back in the heat and dust and blood, Fletcher, Ethan said flatly. "Cole." Fletcher's smile widened. "Been a long time." Heard you were living out here like some kind of hermit. Heard you bought Blackwood's China girl, too. That was stupid, Ethan. Real stupid. She's not going back. Fletcher laughed a sound like wind through dead leaves. You gonna stop me? You a deserter. I could turn you in right now. Army still wants you. $50 reward on your head. Not as much as the girl, but every bit helps. You could try. The smile faded from Fletcher's face. For a moment, something dangerous flickered in his eyes. The look of a man calculating odds, measuring threats. Then the smile returned colder than before. I'll give you 24 hours, Fletcher said quietly. Bring her to Blackwood. I forget I saw you. You can go back to your little cabin and live out your days in peace. Ethan said nothing, simply held Fletcher's gaze, his expression unreadable. Or Fletcher continued stepping closer. I come get her. And you know I will, Ethan. You remember Daniel? That Mexican kid you tried to save. You couldn't save him. You can't save her either. Some people just can't be saved. The words were designed to wound, to burrow under skin and fester. Fletcher was good at that, always had been. 24 hours, Fletcher repeated. Then he turned and walked away, his boots crunching in the frozen mud. Ethan stood motionless for a full minute after Fletcher disappeared into the saloon. Then he turned, mounted Jasper, and began the long ride home. But his mind was not on the trail. It was on calculations, distances, weapons, tactics. Fletcher would come, that was certain. The question was when and how, and whether Ethan could stop him without becoming the very thing he had spent 12 years trying not to be, a killer. He reached the cabin late in the afternoon of the second day. Grace had heard him coming and stood in the doorway, the rifle in her hands, but pointed down. The relief on her face when she recognized him was naked and unguarded. You're back. I said I'd come back. She lowered the rifle and stepped aside to let him in. He unloaded the supplies in silence, his movements efficient but distracted. Grace watched him, sensing something was wrong, but not asking, waiting for him to speak when he was ready. Finally, when the supplies were stored and Jasper was brushed down and fed, Ethan sat at the table and looked at her. Blackwood posted a reward, $100 for your return. Grace's face went pale, but she did not look away. She simply nodded, absorbing the information. There's a bounty hunter. His name is Fletcher. He's coming. When I don't know. Soon. Maybe days. Maybe hours. He reached out and took her hand. The first time he had initiated such contact. Her fingers were cold in his. You have two choices. I can take you to Fort Ellis, get you on a stagecoach headed west. You'll be in California before Fletcher can find you. And the second choice, you stay, and we fight. Grace looked down at their joined hands, at the calluses on his palm that matched the ones on hers, at the scars they both carried. When she looked up, her eyes were clear and certain. How do you know this, Fletcher? We served together in Mexico. He's the one who reported me when I tried to help Daniel. He watched them flog me. He smiled while they did it. And you think you can beat him? I don't know, but I know I won't let him take you. Grace stood, pulling her hand free. She walked to the window and looked out at the darkening forest. When she turned back, her face was set with determination. Then I stay, and we fight. Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The sudden movement startled her, but she held her ground. This isn't your fight, Grace. He's coming for me as much as for you. I'm a deserter. The army still wants me. If you stay, you could die. His voice was raw with an emotion she had never heard before. Fear, not for himself, but for her. If I run, I'll spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, Grace said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. Blackwood will send someone else. Then another. I'll never be free. She stepped closer to him, close enough to see the conflict raging in his eyes. You made it my fight when you bought my contract. You made it my fight when you taught me to shoot, when you showed me I could be more than what they made me. Her hand found his squeezing tight. I'm not the same girl you pulled out of that saloon, Ethan. I'm stronger now because of you, and I won't let you face this alone. For a long moment, they simply stood there, hands clasped, the weight of the decision hanging between them. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters like a warning. All right, Ethan said finally, his voice rough. Then we prepare. Together. They had 2 days, maybe less. But Ethan had learned patience and precision in the Army, and he applied those lessons now. He transformed the cabin from a simple shelter into a defensible position. They started by cutting trees, not the large pines that surrounded the cabin, but smaller saplings that they dragged into rough barriers around the approaches. Not enough to stop anyone determined, but enough to slow them down, to funnel them toward the paths Ethan chose. They dug shallow pits in the snow along the most obvious approach routes, not deep enough to seriously injure, but deep enough to trip someone moving quickly, to make noise, to give warning. They reinforced the door with additional cross braces, carved gun ports in the shutters that covered the windows so they could shoot out, but no one could shoot in. Stockpiled firewood inside so they would not have to venture out. Filled every container they had with water. Ethan drew a map of the surrounding area in the dirt floor, showing Grace the terrain, the approaches, the sight lines, the places where an attacker might take cover, the routes of retreat if the cabin became untenable. If I tell you to run, you run, no arguments. Take Jasper and head east. Don't stop until you reach Fort Ellis. And what about you? Ethan did not answer. They both knew the answer. On the evening of the 31st day, Grace was preparing a stew when Ethan came in from setting the last of their simple traps. He looked at her working at the fire, at the way she moved with confidence through tasks that would have been impossible for her a month ago. My father wasn't just a tailor, she said suddenly, not looking up from the pot. In China, before he came to America, he was a soldier. Qing Army. He fought in the Taiping Rebellion. She turned to face him, and there was something new in her expression, a hardness that had not been there before. He taught me things, how to use a knife, how to fight. I was only 10, but he said a girl needed to know how to defend herself. I'd forgotten most of it, but it's coming back. She pulled a small knife from her boot, 4 inches of steel that she must have taken from Ethan's supplies. She spun it once around her finger with practiced ease, then slid it back into hiding. Ethan felt something shift in his chest. Pride, and fear for her, and a recognition that she was right. She was not the same girl anymore. Why didn't you tell me before? A ghost of a smile touched her lips. You never asked. That night they sat together by the fire, not across from each other as usual, but side by side on the floor, their backs against the wall, weapons within easy reach. The cabin was as ready as they could make it. Now there was nothing to do but wait. Ethan reached out and took her hand. She interlaced her fingers with his, and they sat in silence, feeling the warmth of each other against the cold that pressed in from all sides. Whatever happens, Ethan said quietly, I want you to know I don't regret it. Buying your contract, bringing you here, any of it. Grace squeezed his hand. I know. And I want you to know these 30 days here have been the freest I've been since my father died. Whatever happens next, you've already given me that. They did not sleep that night, simply sat together, holding hands, waiting for the sound of boots in the snow. At 11:45, Grace heard it, the faintest crunch of snow so soft it might have been her imagination. She gripped Ethan's arm without speaking, her eyes wide in the darkness. He nodded. He had heard it too. Fletcher was here. The sound came just after midnight, a soft thud against the outside wall like a clump of snow falling from a branch. But it was too deliberate, too controlled. Ethan was instantly on his feet, the Winchester in his hands, his body a study in lethal stillness. Every muscle coiled, every sense sharpened to a razor edge, honed by years of survival and the brutal lessons of war. He motioned for Grace to get down away from the single window. She crouched behind the heavy wooden table they had repositioned earlier, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird desperate to escape. The Colt Navy revolver he had given her sat heavy in her hands. 6 shots. She had practiced enough to know she could hit a man at 15 feet. Whether she could actually pull the trigger when that man was real and breathing and trying to kill her was another question entirely. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. It was a waiting silence, heavy with threat. The kind of silence that precedes violence, like the stillness before a thunderstorm. Grace could hear her own breathing too loud in the confined space. Could hear the crackle of the fire they had allowed to burn low. Could hear the wild drumming of her pulse in her ears, each beat marking time in a world that had suddenly become very small and very fragile. Then a voice cut through the wind, low and taunting. I know you're in there, rancher, and I know you have got Blackwood's property with you. Make it easy. Send the girl out and I might just let you walk away. It was Fletcher. The voice carried the confidence of a man who had hunted people before and always won. A man who knew that fear was his greatest weapon, and he wielded it with the skill of long practice. Each word was chosen to burrow under the skin, to create doubt, to make them second-guess their decision to stand and fight. Ethan remained silent, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the cabin, his ears straining for any sound of movement. He would not be baited into revealing his position or his plans. The front door was barricaded with the table and two chairs wedged beneath the crossbar. It would hold for a time. Fletcher would have to come through it, and when he did, Ethan would be ready. The Winchester held 16 rounds. He had fired perhaps 10,000 rounds through this particular rifle over the years. He knew its weight and balance like he knew his own heartbeat. Have it your way. The voice drawled with lazy menace, followed by the crunch of boots in the snow, moving toward the door with deliberate steps designed to announce his approach, to build the terror, to make them imagine what was coming. There was a sudden splintering crash as something heavy slammed into the wood near the latch. A boot heel, perhaps, or a length of timber used as a lever. The door shuddered in its frame and dust sifted down from the rafters. Then another blow, harder this time. The heavy bar Ethan had set in place groaned but held. A furious curse from outside, muffled by the wind, but clear in its intent. Then a different sound. The scrape of something being dragged through snow, something heavy and purposeful. A moment later, a battering ram constructed from a fallen pine log slammed into the door with tremendous force. The entire cabin seemed to shake. The wood splintered along one of the vertical planks. The bar cracked but did not break. Not yet. Grace pressed her hands over her mouth to stifle a groan. They had known this was coming, had prepared for it as best they could. But the reality was far more terrifying than the anticipation. The violence was real now, immediate. No longer an abstract threat, but solid wood breaking and time running out. The ram hit again, and this time the bar shattered. Splinters flew inward like shrapnel. The door flew open with a bang that echoed in the small space, revealing the dark shape of Fletcher. He stood framed against the moonlit snow, a pistol in his hand, his breath misting in the freezing air that poured through the opening like water through a broken dam. The smile on his face was the smile of a predator who had finally cornered his prey after a long and satisfying hunt. Now that wasn't so hard, was it? His eyes adjusted quickly to the dim firelight, scanning the interior, with the practiced efficiency of a man who had kicked down doors before. He saw Grace huddled behind the table, exactly where he expected her to be. Fear made people predictable. Fear made them stupid, made them freeze when they should run, hide when they should fight. There you are. Mr. Blackwood will be so pleased to have his property back. He took a step toward her, his pistol raised, his finger tightening on the trigger. He was already counting the money in his head. 100 for the girl, 50 for discretion. In the personal satisfaction of showing Ethan Cole, the deserter, the man who had defied him 12 years ago, that some debts never got paid. Some slights were never forgotten. He never saw Ethan. From the shadows beside the door where he had pressed himself flat against the log wall, becoming part of the darkness itself, Ethan moved. Not with the rifle, which would have been too slow and cumbersome in such close quarters, but with his body. 200 pounds of muscle and bone and 12 years of suppressed rage launched itself at Fletcher with the force of a battering ram. A force born not just of strength, but of absolute necessity. Ethan slammed into Fletcher, driving him backward against the doorframe with enough force to crack ribs. The pistol discharged. The shot was deafening in the small cabin, the muzzle flash blinding in the dim light. Grace felt the concussion in her chest. The bullet buried itself harmlessly in the ceiling, sending splinters of wood raining down like snow. The gun flew from Fletcher's hands, skittering across the floor into the darkness beyond the firelight. The two men were suddenly a tangle of desperate, brutal force. Fletcher was wiry and fast-hardened by years of violence, and a knife appeared in his hand, as if by magic pulled from some hidden sheath at the small of his back. He slashed wildly, the blade catching lamplight as it arced through the air. It cut a deep gash across Ethan's left forearm. Blood welled up immediately, dark and hot, soaking through the fabric of his shirt. Ethan grunted in pain, but did not back down. Could not back down. This was not a fight he could afford to lose. Not when Grace's life hung in the balance. Not when Fletcher would never stop hunting them until one of them was dead. He grabbed Fletcher's wrist as the knife came around for another strike, their faces inches apart, their breath misting and mingling in the cold air that poured through the open door. "She's not property," Ethan snarled, a raw, primal rage in his voice that surprised even him. Words torn from somewhere deep and ancient. "She's not yours to take." He twisted Fletcher's wrist with brutal efficiency, using leverage and weight rather than pure strength. The knife clattered to the floor and both men dove for it. They hit the wooden planks hard enough to drive the air from their lungs. Fletcher was fast, his fingers closing around the handle first, but Ethan brought his elbow down on Fletcher's forearm with a sickening crack. Something broke. Fletcher howled in pain and rage, but his grip on the knife did not loosen. They rolled across the floor, crashing into the table, sending Grace scrambling backward. Using his size and weight, Ethan forced Fletcher onto his back and pinned his knife hand to the floor. But Fletcher was still fighting, kicking his free hand, clawing at Ethan's face, going for the eyes. A cornered animal fighting with the desperate strength of survival. Ethan saw the hate in Fletcher's eyes. The same cold, transactional cruelty he had seen in Blackwood. The same look men got when they stopped seeing other humans as people and started seeing them as things to be used or discarded. He knew with absolute certainty that Fletcher would never stop, would hunt them forever if he walked away from this cabin alive, would find them no matter where they ran or how well they hid. The choice was simple, and it was terrible. The ghost he had been running from for 12 years screamed in his mind. Daniel's face, the rope, the empty eyes, the promise Ethan had made to himself that he would never take another life, that he would live quietly and harm no one and somehow atone for his failure through isolation and self-denial. But a new voice cut through the screaming, Grace's voice, not spoken aloud but present nonetheless, a reminder of what he had already chosen when he put those gold coins on Blackwood's table, when he pulled her onto his horse and rode into the storm, when he taught her to shoot and showed her she could be more than what the world had made her. He had chosen, and now he had to live with that choice. It was swift, brutal, and sickeningly final. The crack of Fletcher's neck breaking was softer than Ethan expected, almost gentle, a sound like green wood snapping, and then it was over. Fletcher's body went limp beneath him, the hate draining from his eyes along with the life. In the ringing silence that followed, the only sounds were the crackling fire and Ethan's own ragged breathing. He stood over Fletcher's still form, his chest heaving, the adrenaline draining away to leave a cold, sick dread in its place that settled in his stomach like a stone. He looked at his hands, at the blood on them, Fletcher's and his own mixing together, and they began to tremble violently, shaking so hard he could barely control them. The man he had kept locked away for 12 years, a man capable of this kind of violence, was free. The ghosts of his past were no longer just memories. They were here in this room, joined by a new one. Fletcher's body cooling on the floor. Another death on his conscience. Another failure of his vow. A wave of nausea and self-loathing washed over him so powerfully that his knees buckled. He sank to the floor, his back sliding down the rough log wall until he sat in a heap. He dropped his head into his hands, and the tremors shook his entire body. Great racking shudders that felt like they might tear him apart from the inside. "I killed him," he whispered to the darkness, to himself, to God if God was still listening to men like him. "I swore I'd never kill again, and I did. I did it again." The sanctuary he had built, the careful distance he had maintained from violence, the 12 years of penance and isolation, all of it was desecrated now. Not by Fletcher's intrusion, but by his own hand, by his own choice. The vow he had made to himself, the one rule that had governed his exile, lay broken at his feet along with Fletcher's corpse. He heard a soft movement and looked up through eyes blurred with something that might have been tears. Grace was emerging from behind the table, stepping carefully over the wreckage of the door and the scattered weapons. Her eyes were wide, fixed not on the body on the floor, but on him, on Ethan, broken and shaking against the wall. He expected to see fear, revulsion. He had shown her the monster inside him, the capacity for lethal violence that he had tried so hard to bury. He deserved her disgust, deserved to be abandoned the way he had abandoned his own principles. But as she came closer, kneeling in front of him on the blood-stained floor, he saw neither fear nor revulsion in her face. Her expression was filled with something else entirely, a fierce, heartbreaking compassion that threatened to undo him completely, a understanding that went deeper than words. She gently took his trembling hands in hers, her touch steady and warm against his cold skin. He tried to pull away, ashamed of the blood on them, ashamed of what those hands had just done. But she held firm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Ethan," she said, her voice soft but clear in the heavy silence. "Look at me." He forced himself to meet her gaze, expecting to see the truth written there. The truth that he was not the man he pretended to be, that he was capable of terrible things, that 12 years in the wilderness had not changed what he was underneath. Tears were tracking paths through the grime on her cheeks, but she was not crying for Fletcher or even for herself. She was crying for him, for the cost of what he had been forced to do, for the price he had paid to keep her safe. "You saved me," she whispered, her thumbs gently stroking the backs of his hands. That man, he was not a man. He was a cage walking on two legs. And you broke it. You broke it so I could be free. She saw the act not as murder but as liberation, not as a fall from grace but as an act of ultimate of protection, of selfless love. She saw the cause, the wound it had inflicted on his soul, and instead of recoiling from it, she moved closer, trying to shoulder some of that burden, to help him carry what he could not carry alone. Ethan shook his head, unable to accept her absolution. "You don't understand. I swore I would never kill again. After Mexico, after Daniel, I swore." Grace's hands tightened on his. "I found the box," she said quietly, "under the floorboards. The letter Daniel wrote." Ethan's eyes widened. "You had no right. He didn't blame you." Grace continued, cutting through his protest. "He thanked you for trying, for being the only one who tried. And he told you not to blame yourself." She leaned closer, her forehead nearly touching his. "You've been carrying guilt that isn't yours for 12 years, punishing yourself for trying to do the right thing. Just like I carried shame for being sold when it wasn't my fault." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "We both need to let go, Ethan. We both need to forgive ourselves for surviving in a world that tried to break us." She took a corner of her sleeve and carefully, tenderly began to wipe the blood from his hands. The simple, intimate act was more powerful than any words. It was absolution made manifest. It was acceptance incarnate. In that moment, the roles they had occupied for the past month were fully and finally reversed. He had saved her body from Blackwood's cruelty, had given her shelter and safety, and the space to heal. And now she was saving his soul from the ghost that had haunted him for 12 long years. Ethan leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers, and finally let the tremor subside. He anchored himself to the small, steady warmth of the woman who had seen the worst of him, the violence and the guilt and the brokenness, and had not turned away. Had chosen instead to stay, to hold his bloodied hands, to tell him that survival was not a sin, and that protecting those who could not protect themselves was worth the cost, even when that cost was terrible. They sat like that for a long time, neither speaking, just breathing together in the ruins of the sanctuary that had become a battlefield. Outside, the wind had died down. The storm was passing. And in the silence, something new was being born. Not forgiveness exactly, because forgiveness implied a wrong that needed pardoning, but acceptance, understanding, the recognition that sometimes there are no good choices, only necessary ones. Finally, Grace pulled back slightly and looked into his eyes. "We need to bury him." Ethan nodded slowly. The practical necessity of it grounded him, pulled him back from the edge of despair. "Yes." Before morning, they buried Fletcher at dawn. The sky was the color of old pewter, heavy with the promise of more snow. They wrapped his body in an old canvas tarp from Ethan's supplies and carried it deep into the woods to a place where the pines grew thick and the snow lay undisturbed. The ground was frozen hard and digging was brutal work. Ethan's wounded arm throbbed with each shovelful of frozen earth, but he welcomed the pain. It was clean, honest, a pain with a purpose. Grace stood watch, a silent sentinel against the cold gray light, the rifle across her arms. She did not speak, did not offer empty words of comfort. She simply stood there, present and solid, a reminder that he was not alone, that whatever came next, they would face it together. When the hole was finally deep enough, they lowered Fletcher's body into it without ceremony. There were no words to say over the unmarked grave, no prayers to offer for a man who had made his living hunting other humans. The act was simply a final somber closing of a chapter. A burial not just of Fletcher's body, but of the claim the outside world had tried to make on their lives. They filled in the grave in silence, packing the dirt and snow down tight. When it was done, Ethan stood looking at the unmarked mound for a long moment, his breath misting in the cold air. He felt Grace's hand slip into his, her fingers interlacing with his own. "It's done," she said quietly. "We survived." Ethan nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. They turned and walked back to the cabin together, their footprints side by side in the fresh snow. The cabin looked different in the morning light. The broken door hung at an angle. Splinters of wood littered the floor. The table was overturned. Blood had dried in dark patches on the floorboards. The physical evidence of violence was everywhere. But as they stood in the doorway surveying the damage, Ethan felt something shift inside him. This was still his home, their home, and they would reclaim it, would rebuild what had been broken, would scrub away the blood and repair the door and transform this place from a battlefield back into a sanctuary. They spent the rest of the day cleaning. Ethan methodically repaired the broken door, his hands sure and steady now, focusing on the familiar work of joining wood and driving nails. The physical labor was meditative, allowing his mind to process what had happened without drowning in it. Grace cleaned the floor, erasing the last traces of the intrusion with soap and hot water and sheer determination. She moved with quiet purpose, her movements filled with a fierce kind of reclamation. They were not just cleaning the cabin, they were taking it back, making it theirs again, rebuilding their world board by board, memory by memory. As the weeks turned into months, the deep snows of winter began to recede. The world outside their window transformed with glacial slowness. The creek, frozen solid for months, began to thaw and sing its rushing song. Birds returned to the pines, their calls filling the morning air with sounds of life returning. The change was mirrored within the cabin as well. The heavy silence of winter healing gave way to easier companionship. They began to talk more, sharing small stories of their pasts, their voices weaving a new history together in the small space. Grace told Ethan about her father's tailor shop, about the smell of silk and the sound of his singing while he worked. Ethan told Grace about growing up in Pennsylvania, about the rolling hills and the forests that seemed endless to a young boy. They did not talk about Fletcher, did not talk about the night of violence. It was there between them, part of their shared history now, but it did not define them. They had survived it. And in surviving, they had become something more than rescuer and rescued. They had become partners, equals. Two people who had looked into the darkness together and chosen to walk back into the light. One warm day in late April, when the snow had retreated to patches in the deepest shadows and the first green shoots were pushing through the mud, Ethan started building a small porch onto the front of the cabin. He worked steadily, carefully, measuring twice and cutting once the way his father had taught him decades ago. Grace watched him work, the rhythmic sound of his hammer like a heartbeat. Steady, reliable, alive. When he was done, she brought out two chairs, and they sat together in the evenings, watching the sunset behind the mountains. The air smelled of damp earth and new life and possibilities, of futures that extended beyond mere survival. Grace planted a garden near the porch, her hands in the rich soil that had been hidden beneath snow for so many months. She planted herbs and hardy vegetables, things that would sustain them through the next winter. Carrots and potatoes and beans. It was an act of faith, a belief in a future that stretched beyond this moment. It was putting down roots in soil and in life. One evening in early May, as they sat on the new porch watching the last light fade from the sky, Ethan reached over and took her hand. It was not a gesture of comfort or rescue. It was something simpler and more profound, a gesture of belonging. His palm was calloused and warm, marked by years of hard work and harder choices. Her fingers fit perfectly between his, as if they had been made for exactly this purpose. "I'm glad you're here, Grace," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the space between them like a bridge. This place, it was just a shelter before. Just walls and a roof, now it's a home. Grace squeezed his hand, her heart full of something she could not quite name, but recognized as peace, as rightness, as the feeling of finally being where she was meant to be. "I am home," she replied. They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell and stars began to appear in the vast Montana sky. They had faced the ghosts of the past and the monsters of the present, had made terrible choices and lived with the consequences, had killed and survived and slowly, painstakingly begun to heal. And in doing so, they had built something that neither had thought possible when Ethan first put those gold coins on Blackwood's table. They had built a life. Not out of grand declarations or dramatic gestures, but out of small, steady acts of care and courage and resilience. Out of showing up every day and choosing each other. Out of learning that redemption was not a destination, but a journey taken one step at a time. The seasons continued their endless cycle. Summer came brief and brilliant, painting the mountains in shades of green and gold. They tended the garden together, watching it grow from fragile shoots into sturdy plants. They fished in the creek and hunted in the forests and stored away provisions for the winter they knew would come again. Autumn arrived in a blaze of color, the aspens turning gold against the dark green of the pines. They harvested the garden, preserving vegetables and drying herbs. The cabin filled with the smells of canning and smoking, the ancient rituals of preparing for lean times. And when winter returned, they were ready. The cabin was snug and well stocked. The firewood was stacked high. And this time they faced the cold and darkness, not as strangers finding their way, but as partners who knew each other's rhythms and needs. On a cold night in December, nearly a year after Fletcher's death, they sat by the fire as had become their custom. But this time Grace rested her head on Ethan's shoulder and his arm was around her. The distance that had once existed between them, the careful space maintained by propriety and uncertainty, had closed. Not suddenly, but gradually, like ice melting in spring. "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked quietly. "Buying my contract." Everything that came after Ethan was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. Then he shook his head slowly. "No, never. You gave me a reason to be more than a hermit hiding from his past. You gave me a reason to fight, to live, to believe that maybe redemption was possible after all." Grace turned to look up at him. "And you gave me back myself, the person I was before the world tried to break me. You saw me as a person, not property. That gift is worth everything." They sat in the warm circle of firelight, the wind howling outside but unable to touch them here. In this place they had defended and rebuilt and made truly theirs. 5 years passed, 5 cycles of seasons, each one carving away more of the pain and leaving behind something harder and stronger and truer. The cabin expanded. Ethan built a second room, then a third. One for Grace to have space of her own, though she rarely used it, preferring to sleep in the main room near the fire and near him. One for storage, and for the future they were building together. The garden grew larger each year, more ambitious, producing more than they needed for just the two of them. Grace had become an expert at preserving food, at making medicines from the herbs she cultivated. Ethan had expanded his trap lines, trading furs and cold water for supplies. Blackwood had died 2 years ago, his saloon now run by someone else, someone who did not deal in human cargo. The town had changed. Or perhaps they had changed, and the town simply seemed different through their eyes. They were not married, not in any legal sense. There was no church within 50 miles, no magistrate who cared about a former deserter and a former contract laborer. But in every way that mattered, they were bound together by shared history and shared purpose, and the deep understanding that comes from facing death together and choosing life. On a warm spring morning in April of 1892, exactly 5 years after the night Fletcher had come to their door, Ethan and Grace stood on the porch they had built together. The garden was already showing the first green shoots of the season. The air was sweet with pine and earth and the promise of growth. 2 small children played in the garden, chasing each other between the rows with shrieks of laughter that echoed across the valley. Daniel, named for the boy Ethan had failed to save, but would honor by raising his son to be kind and brave. 4 years old, with dark hair and his mother's eyes and his father's steady nature. And Sarah, 2 years old, named for Ethan's mother, with her father's height already evident in her long limbs and her mother's quick smile. Watching them play, Grace felt tears prick at her eyes. Happy tears, grateful tears. 5 years ago, she had been a slave in all but name, coughing blood in a frozen saloon, certain she would die there. Now she stood on her own land with her own family, free in ways she had never imagined possible. She felt Ethan's arm come around her waist, pulling her close. He rested his chin on top of her head, and they stood together watching their children play in the garden they had planted together. "I never thought I could have this," Ethan said quietly. "A family, a home, happiness. I thought I'd forfeited the right to it when I deserted, when I failed Daniel. Grace leaned into him. You didn't fail, Daniel. You tried. That's all any of us can do. Try. And when we fail, we try again. We keep trying until we get it right. Movement at the edge of the clearing caught their attention. Both of them tensed old reflexes never entirely forgotten. Ethan's hand moved toward the rifle that still leaned by the door. But Grace put her hand on his arm, staying him. Wait, she said quietly. A figure emerged from the trees, eyes. A young woman, perhaps 19 or 20, leading a horse. She was Native American Blackfeet from the beadwork on her dress. But the dress was torn and dirty. Her face was bruised, one eye swollen shut. She moved slowly, painfully, like someone who had been beaten and was still healing. She stopped at the edge of the clearing, perhaps 30 feet away. She did not approach further, did not make any threatening moves. Simply stood there, one hand on her horse's bridle, looking at the cabin with an expression that Ethan recognized. The look of someone who had run out of places to run to. The look of someone making a final desperate gamble. Grace saw it too. Saw herself 5 years ago standing in Blackwood's saloon with nowhere to go and no hope left. She felt Ethan's eyes on her, felt the silent question passing between them. Can we, should we, is there room for one more soul-seeking sanctuary? Grace stepped down from the porch, moving slowly so as not to startle the young woman. She walked halfway across the clearing and stopped, leaving space between them, leaving the choice in the stranger's hands. You're safe here, Grace said, her voice carrying clearly across the distance. No one will hurt you anymore. My name is Grace. That's my husband, Ethan. And those are our children, Daniel and Sarah. She gestured back toward the cabin, toward the family, and the life she had built from ashes and blood and sheer determination. What's your name? The young woman's shoulders sagged with relief so profound it was almost a collapse. Tears began to stream down her bruised face. Ayana, she whispered. My name is Ayana. Grace smiled, the kind of smile that held understanding and compassion and the knowledge of how hard it was to accept help when you had been hurt so badly. The kind of smile that said you are not alone and you are not broken beyond repair, and there is still hope in this world if you know where to look for it. Come down, Ayana. Come inside. You must be hungry, cold. We have food and warm clothes and a safe place to sleep. She held out her hand across the distance, palm up, an offering and an invitation. Ayana took one step forward, then another, and then she was moving, half walking and half running, leading her horse behind her. When she reached Grace, she stopped, uncertain, trembling. Grace reached out and took her hand, feeling the calluses and scars that spoke of hard labor and harder treatment, feeling the trembling that came from cold and fear and exhaustion. You're home now, Grace said gently. Welcome to the sanctuary. She led Ayana toward the cabin where Ethan stood waiting with that same quiet acceptance he had shown Grace 5 years ago. The children had stopped playing and were watching with wide, curious eyes. Inside, the fire was warm, and there was soup on the stove, and clean clothes in the chest, and all the small comforts of a home built on the foundation of survival and love. As Grace helped Ayana settle in, finding her warm clothes and a bowl of soup and a place by the fire to rest, Ethan stood on the porch and looked out at the forest, at the mountains rising in the distance, at the garden where his children played, and the smoke rising from the chimney, and the life he had somehow managed to build despite everything. He thought about the question people sometimes asked him when they came through trading furs or buying supplies. If he regretted it, buying Grace's contract, killing Fletcher, becoming known as the man who would shelter those who had nowhere else to go. The answer was always the same. Regret is for men who had choices. I didn't. She needed saving. I needed redemption. We found both in each other, and that was the truth of it. This cabin had started as his prison, the place where he had come to hide from his failures and his guilt. It had become their sanctuary, the place where two broken people had found a way to heal. And now it was becoming something more. A beacon. A light in the darkness for others who were lost and hurting and in need of a place to belong. Over the following months and years, others would come. Not many. The cabin was remote and the journey difficult, but word spread in quiet ways among those who needed to hear it. There was a place in the mountains where broken people could find shelter, where former slaves and abused ways and those fleeing violence could find safety and a chance to start over. Ethan and Grace never turned anyone away. They expanded the cabin again, adding more rooms. They taught skills to those who came farming and hunting and how to survive in the wilderness. They provided safe passage to other towns for those who wanted to move on and a home for those who wanted to stay. Daniel grew up knowing that his home was a place of sanctuary. That strength was not about dominating others, but about protecting those who could not protect themselves. That his father was a man who had made mistakes and found redemption through service to others. Sarah learned from her mother that survival was an act of defiance and that helping others survive was an act of revolution. That being a woman did not mean being weak or being property, that she could be anything she chose to be. And Ayana, who had arrived broken and terrified, slowly healed and eventually chose to stay. She taught the others her language and her tribe's ways of reading the forest and understanding the rhythms of the natural world. She fell in love with a trapper named James who treated her with respect and kindness, and they built their own cabin a mile to the east, close enough to be part of the community, but far enough for privacy and independence. On a warm evening in late summer, 10 years after Ethan had first walked into Blackwood's saloon and put gold coins on the table, he sat on the porch with Grace beside him. Their children were older now, Daniel nearly 14 and Sarah 12, both strong and capable and kind. Around them, the small community they had built carried on with the evening rituals of cooking and cleaning and preparing for sleep. "Do you think Daniel would be proud?" Grace asked quietly, knowing Ethan would understand she meant the Daniel from his past, the boy he had tried and failed to save. Ethan was silent for a long moment, watching the sun set behind the mountains in streaks of gold and crimson. Then he nodded slowly. "I think he'd say I finally did the right thing, not in spite of failing him, but because of it. His death taught me that doing nothing is worse than trying and failing. That standing by while others suffer is not neutrality, but complicity." He reached over and took Grace's hand, their fingers interlacing with the easy familiarity of a decade together. "He taught me that redemption is not about forgetting the past or pretending it didn't happen. It's about using the lessons of that pain to prevent future pain. It's about building something good from the ashes of something terrible." Grace squeezed his hand. "You built more than that. You built a legacy. This place, these people, this community. It will outlive us both. And it started because you refused to walk away when you saw someone suffering." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell and stars began to appear in the vast Montana sky. Inside the cabin, lamps were being lit and children were being put to bed, and the small rituals of domestic life continued. The sounds of home, of family, of belonging. Ethan thought about the sergeant he had been so certain of his righteousness that he had not understood the cost of defying authority. About the deserter he had become so consumed by guilt that he had nearly destroyed himself. About the hermit he had been hiding from the world and his own failure. And about the man he had become, a husband, a father, a protector of those who needed protecting. Not a hero. Heroes did not have to make the choices he had made or carry the burdens he carried. But a man who had learned that redemption was not a destination, but a journey. That you could not undo the past, but you could choose what to build from its ruins. As a last light faded from the sky and the first stars emerged in their ancient patterns, Ethan Cole felt something he had not felt in 22 years. Not happiness, exactly. Not the absence of pain or regret, but something quieter and more enduring. Peace, the knowledge that he had done what he could with what he had been given, that he had turned his failures into lessons and his guilt into action, that the boy who had died could not be brought back, but other boys and girls and women and men could be saved, could be given the chance he had been unable to give Daniel. And that was enough. It had to be enough, because it was all any of them could do. Try, fail, learn, try again. Keep trying until the darkness receded and the light returned and something new grew from the ashes of what had been lost. This cabin in the wilderness, this sanctuary built by two broken people who had found each other in the depths of winter and learned to heal together, had become more than a home. It had become a promise, a testament, a legacy that would outlive them both. And as Ethan sat there with Grace's hand in his and their children sleeping safely inside, and the community they had built carrying on around them, he knew that Daniel would indeed be proud. That the boy who had written that letter asking Ethan not to blame himself would see what had been built from that guilt and that pain and would know that his death had not been meaningless, that some good can come even from the darkest moments, that redemption is always possible for those willing to do the work. That sanctuary exists not as a place but as a choice made every day to stand against cruelty and offer shelter to those who need it most. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. The mountains stood silent and eternal. And in a small cabin in the Montana wilderness, two people who had saved each other sat together in the darkness, holding hands and looked toward a future they had built from nothing but determination and love, and the simple, profound act of refusing to look away from suffering. The sanctuary endured,